It's a surprisingly common sentiment that the Generation 6 legendary, Xerneas, being absent in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is an overall positive for the game, and many are worried that Fairy Terastalization being used on Xerneas may come in Pokemon Champions. But Xerneas was released over a decade ago in 2013 with Pokemon X and Y. Does he really still stack up to modern Power Creep? Let's analyze the metagame to see if Xerneas truly would have taken over Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. First, we need to understand why Xerneas was, and still is, so feared. There's a lot of places we could start, but let's first take a look at the least impressive portion, its stats. Xerneas is classified as a restricted Pokemon, meaning, depending on the format, can be only 1 or 2 box art or equivalent legendaries on the team. Like most restricted, it boasts a high base stat total of 680, and when looking at its stats, they might be the only thing that's actually balanced and well enough made. I know that sounds crazy when looking at the 131 base attack and 131 base special attack, but that's actually why it's balanced. Compare that to Generation 8 Zacian. With 700 base stat total and 170 base attack, it only has 80 special attack, for a difference of 90 points. Because Zacian never uses its special attack stat, that's 90 points it gets to put into its speed and its bulk. Xerneas could have moved 70 points to either its special attack, or its bulk, or its speed. But regardless, it still has a high HP stat, and its bulk is rather middling, and so is its speed. It's not a glass cannon, but it's also not really an impressive wall. For now, at least. Next is its typing. In Generation 5, Black and White, Dragon type was easily considered the strongest type, with a weakness only to itself and Ice, while Ice being considered one of the worst types. X and Y debuted the Fairy type, with Xerneas as its mascot. Fairy is immune to Dragon, and additionally resists Fighting, Bug, and Dark. But the reason Fairy is so strong is because it's weak solely to Poison and Steel, the two most defensive types. At the time it was released at least, Fairy is only resisted by 3 types, Fire, Poison, and Steel, making it great offensively as well. Fairy, since it's been released, has been considered the strongest type, and Xerneas boasts a mono Fairy type. Part of Fairy having only 3 types that resist it makes Xerneas' ability even better. Xerneas has the Fairy Aura ability. All Fairy type attacks gain a 33% boost to their damage. Of course, that's stacked with the 50% same type attack boost, or stab, that Pokemon get from using moves of their type. That means the 95 base power Moonblast will have a base power of 190 after all the buffs, a 99.5% power boost. For comparison, Dazzling Gleam would go from 75 to 149.6 power. Compare that to Calyrex Shadow Rider's Astral Barrage. With its stab, it goes from 120 to 180 base power. Xerneas puts everything into its Fairy type, which is the best offensive and defensive type in the game, which is why Tera Fairy is such a scary premise, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So Xerneas is the best type and can hit really hard, but is that it? It's not the fastest nor the bulkiest, so what's the deal? Simple. Well, not simple as in the ability, but simple to explain. Xerneas' signature move, Geomancy. Spending a turn charging, Xerneas can get a 2-stage boost into its special attack, special defense, and speed. But clicking Quiver Dance twice gets the same 2-stage boost, so Geomancy isn't that ridiculous, right? Firstly, Quiver Dance is one of the most powerful moves in Pokemon, which is why so few Pokemon get it, and so many get Calm Mind instead. More importantly, there's a really big issue to Geomancy's design. One item. What item takes Xerneas from being really good to meta breaking? Power Herb. Power Herb allows charge moves to skip their first turn of charge the first time you use it. And that includes Geomancy. Meaning in one turn, Xerneas destroys all semblance of balance, an unbeatable special wall that becomes too fast and hits too hard. Now add everything from before. Spread stab with 149 base power or single target 190 base power. Only 2 weaknesses, neither offensively too viable, but only 3 types resist it, and it's almost always capable of picking up a 2-hit knockout on a neutral hit. That's why, in the worlds that Xerneas was legal in, it won easily each time. Well, not 2016, because Wolf Click won, and that was him using his newly acquired World Champ difference. And 2019 has new Ultra Beasts and whatnot, so it unfortunately got counterplayed there. But 2022, it definitely won. Well, no, because Zacian was too overwhelming. But the rest of them it won. All, well, 0 other times. Hold on, it never won Worlds? So then what happened? When you have a Pokemon this strong, everyone should be using it to win. But what often happens instead is everyone wants to beat it. Xerneas had a hit on its head. Take Wolf's 2016 team. The biggest weakness to Xerneas is that it takes a turn to charge and gains a massive speed boost. That speed boost is a double-edged sword. Wolf has a Bronzong on his team, a Steel Psychic type that resists Xerneas, and has Levitate to be immune to Xerneas' common partner, Groudon. Bronzong has 2 important moves to beat Xerneas: Trick Room and Gyro Ball. Trick Room reverses the speed order, so Xerneas has, with the double speed, nearly always moves last. Gyro Ball is a Steel type attack that does more power based upon their speed difference. Bronzong's Gyro Ball will hit the max 150 base power into Xerneas every time, and it hits its unboosted physical defense. Another counter was Primal, who does more damage based on the more HP it has, and in Primordial Sea could hit for 50% or so into the boosted Xerneas the turn it set up, and its sky-high special defense let it take a hit or two neutrally. Actually, all 3 Hoenn legendaries counter Xerneas. Primal Groudon resists it and hits physically, while Mega Rayquaza can use the move Extreme Speed to ignore the speed boost and hit ridiculously hard physically as well. After Generation 6, it didn't fare much better. Most of its partners received nerfs going into Sun and Moon. Partners like Kangaskhan, Salamence, Talonflame, and Smeargle all took heavy nerfs to either their abilities or their move pools, or both. Even the new Pokemon seemed intent to beat Xerneas. Solgaleo or Necrozma Dustmane had a Steel type signature. 5 Ultra Beasts had Steel or Poison types, those being Kartana, Celesteela, Nihilego, Stakataka, and Naganadel. Generation 8, Xerneas never had a chance. Remember Zacian? Steel Fairy with 170 base attack and gains a 50% attack boost, so it's more like 255 base attack with super effective stab physical damage. Xerneas faints before it can even use its power herb. Going in Generation 9, people are scared of Xerneas again. To complete the ping pong of it's too strong to it's too weak, finally back to it's too strong once more, Generation 9 would have been very kind to Xerneas. Zacian lost 20 points into its attack, and Intrepid Sword only works the first time it enters battle, so Intimidate can easily ruin it. Additionally, Terastalization would have been incredibly powerful. Dynamax was pretty much worthless for it, as it removes spread damage, can't use status moves while Dynamax, and Zacian dealt double damage to Dynamax Pokemon regardless. Meanwhile, Terastalization can be used to gain a 50% boost to Fairy attacks to stack with its other boost, or could be used defensively to take on the Steel type to be immune and resist the 2 types it's weak to. Or another option that only having Xerneas in the meta could have determined. Side tangent, so with Terastalization, there's an important distinction between additive and multiplicative modifiers. In Pokemon, nearly every single modifier in the game is multiplicative. Fairy Aura, Stab, crits, weather, items, everything else. Terastalization into a new type also gives you the multiplicative 50% stab boost. However, if you Terastalize into a type you already have, your stab boost gains a 50% additive boost. So your 2 stab boosts stack 50% plus 50% into 100% of a total boost, and now that 100% is multiplicative. So if you run the math, it's approximately a 33% multiplicative boost, which is actually the same as Fairy Aura, ironically. Long story short though, Tera Fairy Aura double stab is a total boost of 266% compared to non-Tera, which is 199.5% boost. So what else is better for Xerneas? The Hoenn trio is now a fraction of its former glory, almost entirely irrelevant to major VGC events. So finally, we can look into the question, would Xerneas have ruined Scarlet and Violet? For this hypothetical meta, we're going to use the same decks, just with the addition of Xerneas, Yveltal, and Zygarde. We could use the national decks, but then I feel like I'd end up talking way more about 2016 and 2019, then I would actually get to talk about Scarlet and Violet. So we're just going to add those 3. We'll start with 2014 Worlds before moving on to 2025, as single restricted is much better at showing the individual interactions the restricteds have with each other. So looking at the top cut, there were 7 total restricteds: Ice Rider, Shadow Rider, Miraidon, Zamazenta, Terapagos, Kyogre, and Zacian. So perhaps I over-exaggerated Zacian and Kyogre's deaths slightly, but I think only 1 or 2 trainers actively used each one. So how does Xerneas match into everything here? Actually, we gotta step back, and there's something else I want to discuss first. Yveltal. Calyrex both forms make up about 55% of the top cut of restricteds, with a ×2 and ×4 weakness to Dark on both Calyrexes. Dark Aura Yveltal, plus maybe something like Dark Urshifu, would have potentially run numbers against them. Of course, the Calyrexes both have Teras that typically end up resisting Dark, but the natural Yveltal matchup is already in such a good place as is. Pretty much what I'm trying to say is I think Yveltal would have had potentially a small enough share of the meta, with Calyrexes losing some of theirs, which in the end would be good for Xerneas, as Xerneas naturally has a very good matchup into Yveltal, being super effective and resisting the Dark type attacks. Now, we can finally return to Xerneas and get this started. Going from most used to least used restricted, we're going to start with Ice Rider. If you know anything about Ice Rider, is that it loves Trick Room. Most sets of the time were Clear Amulet with Trick Room, Glacial Lance, High Horsepower, and Protect. And then usually a Tera type that resists fire, usually fire, water, or dragon, respectively. Sometimes you would see the rare grass set, but that's usually a different type of team. Xerneas would most likely push it to run mainly fire, but I doubt the movesets would actually change too much. It's a hard-hitting physical attacker, and it can use Geomancy as a trap. The team that got second at 2024 Worlds actually used the Tera Grass Rain team I just mentioned. Tera Water Rain Urshifu Surging Strikes, this one uses a sash, could actually hit Xerneas for a one-hit KO, which actually makes a very difficult pin. Depending on the bulk investment on Xerneas, it's almost always a guaranteed 2-KO. Turn 1 Rapid Strikes, followed by Xerneas Geomancy, then with Calyrex using Trick Room. The Surging Strikes will do about that 50%, a little bit more, and then in Trick Room, after a Geomancy, Urshifu will underspeed the Xerneas, so it can either pick up the KO itself, or a Glacial Lance also hits very hard. Now, you can try to counteract this with something like an Ogre Palm Water, with its Water Absorb Follow Me, and then using your Geomancy Moonblast, you actually have a 50% chance to get the Oko into Calyrex, assuming it has a max special attack on the Xerneas and max HP on the Calyrex, which is again pretty standard sets. However, that 50% chance can easily become a one-hit if you decide to use Fairy Terastalization. So the ability to get a one-hit KO into a Calyrex is actually very rare and bodes pretty well for Xerneas into the future. However, the problem is if you can get off that Geomancy into Moonblast, because if a Trick Room gets set, a Moongus threatens as well, as it resists Xerneas. For example, same scenario as before, now you use a Follow Me on the Ogre Pawn to try to redirect the Surging Strikes. However, instead it switches out into a Moongus. Meanwhile, you have a Geomancy and a Trick Room both coming up. Another potential counter could be something like Fake Out on an Incineroar. You would use Fake Out on the Incineroar, break the sash of the Urshifu, and then click something like D-Gleam. This will not only take out the Urshifu, but it will definitely put the Calyrex into Moonblast range. However, again, this risks setting up that Trick Room, and then now you give a free switch into a Moongus. It could mean you just have to take a Glacial Lance, and there's not a great option post that turn. But trying to sequence our way through every possible scenario isn't going to get us too far. What I'm saying is Focus Sash on Urshifu is a very, very big threat. It can take KOs very quickly, and it's very hard to get through while setting up Geomancy. To pair that with something like Trick Room, and now Xerneas doesn't know what speed it wants to be at. And so, point being, Tera Fairy Xerneas isn't actually always a win button, and there's even other types of Kyrex teams. The 5th place team had Torkoal Psy-Spam Hard Trick Room. There's also the possibility of an Ursaluna in Trick Room, which Facade Guts should take the one-hit KO. There's a multitude of options against the Xerneas play. But I'm definitely not counting Xerneas out. It's a very winnable matchup on both ends, and I think the team building is where this game might be won, as well as very, very hard reads you have to make at the start of the game. Although none surprisingly made top 8, there were also a ton of Shadow Riders in Top Cut. Xerneas and Shadow Rider have actually a pretty similar playstyle, buff their special attack, and then blow up the other side. There's many Shadow Rider sets, but all the Top Cut ones were Life Orb or Spell Tag with some form of defensive Terra. Life Orb Astral Barrage hits Xerneas for about 70%, while Moonblast also hits Kyrex for about 70%. And here's where the fun part of this matchup really is. Nasty Plot and Geomancy both allow for an OHKO. However, Geomancy allows Xerneas to survive the ×2 Astral Barrage, and it'll even allow it to outspeed for the OHKO. And Terra Gleam also allows it to pick up the one-hit KO after a Geomancy. But Kyrex, it's immune to Fake Out, so Nasty Plot plus Fake Out will actually win the game if it goes through. However, Armor Tail and Psychic Terrain both exist to block Fake Out and allow Geomancy. Lastly, we also have to consider that every single Shadow Rider team has had either or both Rillaboom or Urshifu Rapid Strike, which, as we know from Urshifu, and I can attest for Rillaboom, can do at least 50% or more. Meaning, if it attacks and Kyrex also attacks, it can either set up or be set up for the KO. But Protect Trick Room allows Xerneas to go before Shadow Rider, and now if you have some sort of Psy-Spam or Expanding Force, you can double up and take out the Shadow Rider. Of course, some teams also have a Moongus, so setting up a Trick Room and then your opponent switches in a Moongus, threatening a Spore, might not even be the best. And again, like with Ice Rider, this type of thing can run on forever. And again, like with Ice Rider, it's probably another one of those 50-50 prediction type games that are often won based upon leads and based upon what you think your opponent is going to do and how you build your own team to deal with multitudes of play. The last thing I do want to mention is that Shadow Rider, with a Life Orb, using Terra Steel, Terra Blast, will OHKO a Xerneas without any buffs or any needed support. So, if Xerneas was around, there's a very real chance the meta may have shifted slightly to Terra Steel, Terra Blast Kyrex, just like how I think Ice Riders may definitely opt for more Fire Terras if Xerneas was around, as that gives it that resistance to Fairy. The next restricted to discuss is the one that won Worlds in 2024, Miraidon. And this is a very interesting Pokemon to compare to Xerneas. That's because Tera Fairy Miraidon is very similar to Xerneas. Both get a 33% boost to Fairy type attacks from their abilities, both get Stab either naturally or through Terra as well, and their special attacks have a difference of 4. The differences then become Xerneas gets an additional boost from its Terra and can get the ×2 Geomancy boost. Meanwhile, Choice Specs are a bigger boost than Fairy Terra on Xerneas would actually be, and Miraidon's electric attacks are stronger than its Fairy attacks regardless. And it grants immunity to Spore being in electric terrain, doesn't require a turn to set up, and has fast pivot with Volt Switch. Speaking of, a modest Volt Switch has a 30% chance to KO Xerneas with 0 Volt. Once again, the importance of Fake Out for both these Pokemon really matters, which is why Luca's World Champion team bought a Farigiraf with Armor Tail. A specially bulky Farigiraf could survive the non-boosted Terra Moonblast and set up a Trick Room. However, it won't take it too well, surviving with about 20-30% left, potentially in the range for a double up. But if Miraidon Electro Drifts turn 1, Xerneas is out 100% of the time. It will need effectively max special bulk to have even a chance to survive the hit. Sure, you can switch Rillaboom to remove the terrain, but you're still eating 75 to 85% damage into that Xerneas. Miraidon, as a restricted, despite being choice locked, might offer more flexibility and raw damage output without the need to set up. Zamazenta, a restricted, Xerneas has actually met before. In Pokemon Sword and Shield, its box art game, Zamazenta was at best underwhelming. Its defense boost was less impressive as it sounds because defense starts to give very diminishing returns. It's actually a very interesting topic. The quick of it, offense divided by defense multiplied against 2 times the level, which in VGC is 50, divided by 5 plus 2, multiplied again by the move power all of that over 50, and then given a damage range of 85 to 100% randomly. To show what I mean by diminishing returns, if we take an 80 base power attack with a 100 attack stat versus 100 defense stat, you end up getting 35 damage max. Now, if your Pokemon has 200 defense, you end up getting 18 damage max, and 300 defense gets you 12 damage max. So the damage difference between 100 and 200 defense is 17 due to the rounding of the integer, while the difference between 200 and 300 defense is only 6, but you still put in 100 points to your stat. For fun, Zacian in Sword and Shield could hit 366 attack. That hits 100 defense for 129 damage, assuming it's an 80 base power move, not his signature 100 base power. It hits into 200 defense for 64 damage, and into 300 defense for 43. So having high defense, and then getting another defense boost on top of that, is not really as impressive when you consider it against a big attack boost. Zamazenta likely would have actually preferred to get a physical attack boost because its signature move is an 100 base power physical attack. Plus, it only actually learns 4 fighting type moves, those being counter, reversal, focus blast, and close combat. None of them are actually good for a defensive wall that doesn't take much damage. And the final nail in the coffin, Zamazenta can't Dynamax. Zamazenta would have been able to use those physical fighting type attacks to gain a boost with Max Knuckle, and that 12 to 43 damage it was taking, getting it cut again effectively in half because you get your double HP, would have actually been much more impressive for that higher defense stat. But no, Zamazenta was effectively unusable in its own game. So why am I talking about it here? Going into Scarlet and Violet, like Zacian, it received some nerfs. It lost 10 attack, 5 defense, and 5 special defense. Unlike Zacian, its nerfs were spread out. Sorry, we'll talk about Zacian later, despite bringing it up like 3 times. As we just saw, the higher the defense, the less impactful it actually becomes, and its attack went from 130 to 120, but Zamazenta was never a high damage threat where it needed that small boost to pick up Okos. Its ability now also only activates the first time Zamazenta enters the battle, similar to how Zacian's Intrepid Sword got nerfed. And finally, its signature move, Behemoth Bash, lost its secondary effect, or at least it's lost it for now, as Dynamax may return in Champions as well, bringing it back. Zamazenta actually did receive some major buffs as well. Firstly, it gained 2 new moves, Body Press and Heavy Slam. Body Press uses the user's defense as the numerator in that damage equation, so those diminishing returns now can be utilized offensively. Additionally, Shen Pao and Sword of Ruin were added to the game. Sword of Ruin lowers all the Pokemon's defense except its own. That implies to Zamazenta, but like a broken record, the higher the defense, the less impactful each stat point becomes. Secondly, whether a bug or an intentional quirk, Sword of Ruin does not lower the defense stat when calculating for Body Press offensively. Next, it gained Heavy Slam. Zamazenta is heavy, being the 14th heaviest Pokemon ever, and if you only count Pokemon in forms in Generation 9, it jumps to 7th, and that's still with me counting Pokemon like Mudstale and Glastrier that have 0 competitive use or will never be used over a Pokemon like Calyrex Ice Rider. It also is enough to usually get max damage against Ghost and Fairy types, as they're typically incredibly light. Finally, in a game without Dynamax, Wide Guard becomes essential to stop a lot of Pokemon, such as Shadow Riders, Ice Riders, Kyogre, Terapagos, Groudon, and a few non-restricted. So, what of it for Xerneas? 1730.6 going into 474. That's a base power of 80. Even with attack investment, that'll never get the OHKO, but also will already be a guaranteed 2KO without attack investment. Max Special Defense Zamazenta never survives Geomancy Terra Fairy Moonblast. Now, I've not played Zamazenta before, nor will I pretend that I really know how. However, I do want to point out, Sword of Ruin, Max Attack, Heavy Slam does have an 87.5% chance to OHKO. What I mean to say is I checked Body Press Sword of Ruin and it's not a better option. So does that mean Xerneas holds the advantage? Maybe a little, but that's not to say Zamazenta is down and out. Heavy Slam plus Ice Spinner in Sword of Ruin should guarantee the KO, and Wide Guard is useful into Dazzling Gleam even after Geomancy is used. Is it perfect? No. Especially because Zamazentas really like to take Terra Dragon. For example, Mikhail Kelsch's 3rd place team used that Terra. I definitely would place this matchup in Xerneas' favor, but it is by no means free. Did I just spend all the time on how defense works, why Zamazenta got terrible, got buffed, got nerfed, just to say the matchup is slightly against it? Yeah, I did, but I'm here to be impartial. If my research said Xerneas wins every matchup with no difficulty, I would have reported that, but looking at the meta threats, I've not yet found a free win for Xerneas. I'm going to break the pattern. Technically, Terapagos is next, but I've mentioned Zacian over 10 times by now, plus I just finished his partner, so I think I should finally talk about Sword Dog. This is real quick and real easy. Zacian can Lost Intrepid Sword, then get Intimidated, have 0 attack IVs, have a negative attack nature, and still guarantee the OHKO into Xerneas, and no amount of speed investment allows Xerneas to ever outspeed a 0-speed Zacian. It can also, with 4 EVs into its special defense, always survive at least one Geomancy Tera Fairy Moonblast. This is quite possibly the worst matchup for Xerneas. There's not much more to it. Sure, the supporting cast can change things, you might even just decide to leave Xerneas behind for this matchup. But tell me, does this inspire the image of Xerneas standing above all other restricteds, hands down? It doesn't to me. Now we can get to the turtle. There are 2 main sets you would find with Terapagos, Choice Specs and Leftovers Combine. For Choice Specs, if something, say Fake Out by a partner Incineroar, breaks Terra Shell, Geomancy Moonblast pretty much always gets the OHKO. Technically 2 hits, but you get the idea. Pagos is only ever able to do about 40% max with Terra Stellar after a Geomancy, and unless you have max HP and about 100 special defense CVs, which would be incredibly bizarre for a damageable Pagos, it gets one-shot by Geomancy Tera Fairy Moonblast 100%. Again, everyone has their ranges. You need max HP, max special defense, plus a special defense nature to guarantee the survival. That'd be an abysmal spread for pretty much any other matchups, and it's still not that great for this one. Returning to the reasonable calculations of max HP and special attack, D-Gleam has a 56% chance to OHKO, so depending on your Fake Out user, you may even get enough from it for the KO. Combine probably won't fare much better, mainly because trading a Combine for a Geomancy is not a good trade. You get +1, they get +2, +2, +2. I could dwell on this matchup some more, but I think Xerneas finally has a very positive matchup. The last restricted of Worlds 2024 to discuss is Kyogre, and these two have a historic rivalry. Many counter teams in 2016 circuit use Kyogre Rayquaza. Wolf Glick won with Kyogre, along with Mega Gengar and Bronzong as Xerneas walls, which is not to say Primal Kyogre relied solely on its allies. It could dish out over 50% through Geomancy with a full HP Water Spout. It could take a Geomancy Moonblast with an impressive 160 special defense. If left alone, it could actually just 2-shot Xerneas, and it was often paired with a partner that could also dish out heavy damage to the deer. That was a while ago. Without the Blue Orb, Kyogre is not too much weaker for it, can't hit as hard as before, can't take a Moonblast as well. Yes, Drizzle is less reliable than Primordial Sea. But overall, when comparing the primal forms, Kyogre's is by far the least impactful when you compare it to Groudon's and Mega Rayquaza respectively. Items like Mystic Water or Choice Scarf are enough to make up that difference on Kyogre. That's why I think Kyogre vs Xerneas is largely actually the same as it was in the past. Kyogre can definitely manage it, but it really needs support. But would the current game have enough new faces to be Kyogre's allies? Yes. Remember Terra Water Urshifu? Yeah, in the rain, it does about a guaranteed OHKO. That one, I think, is on every Kyogre team already. Oliver Escalin placed 14th at Worlds with the Whale. He had Incineroar, Rillaboom, Amoonguss, and Roaring Moon along with those two. Assault Vest, Terrafire, Rillaboom is a pretty good matchup into the Fairy Special Attacker. Incineroar is, well, Incineroar. Amoonguss is Poison type, resists, and can put Xerneas to sleep. And unlike in 2019, Pokemon added Dynamic Speed. So Dynamic Speed is coding that allows speed changes to impact the turn order during the turn itself, not simply after. So if Roaring Moon sets up a Tailwind, Terra Water Water Spout guarantees a KO into all but the most bulky of Xerneas before they can even click Geomancy. Some other support Pokemon include Bronzong of the past, who may not see much play anymore, but with Xerneas running about, likely could have had a place. Sneasel or Dire Claw can outspeed Geomancy with its Unburden, and Tuco with the super effective Dire Claw. Gholdengo's Steel type could help wall the Xerneas and dish out heavy damage. And although Kyogre does not prefer Trick Room, Ursaluna on certain teams could definitely be a viable counter. Kyogre may have lost its original allies, but it wouldn't be inaccurate to say there are a lot of potential new Pokemon to support each other and prevent a Xerneas takeover. Although Kyogre is the final restricted of the 2024 Worlds, there's one last restricted Pokemon that I want to talk about as it gained popularity very late into the 2025 circuit, Koraidon. I think Koraidon is the most obvious show of why I don't think Xerneas would ruin the meta. In a vacuum, Koraidon should have the most negative of negative matchups, with a quadruple weakness from Fairy type attacks. It requires a Life Orb to pick up the OHKO, which means it's susceptible to Intimidate because Clear Amulet maxes out damage at 94.5%. Xerneas could either OHKO with D-Gleam or Geomancy and outspeed next turn, so it should be the easiest of easiest matchups for Xerneas. Until Koraidon clicks his silly little Tera Fire button. Now, Koraidon can OHKO through Intimidate with Life Orb or Clear Amulet at neutral. It also lowers non-boosted Tera Moonblast, which used to do 400% damage, to an abysmal 50%. And sometimes, with Geomancy, it won't even be a guaranteed OHKO. And that right there is my diagnosis of why Xerneas wouldn't take over. The new Pokemon are simply too strong. Well, sort of. When Xerneas was released over a decade ago, it didn't have some special gimmick. It was released next to Mega Evolution and Primal Reversion, but it was always just Xerneas. And just Xerneas was enough to contend with Primal Kyogre and Groudon and Mega Rayquaza. Mega Evolution took these from what were great to game-breaking. Geomancy Xerneas is often considered game-breaking as well. But I think we reached a new tier. Gen 8 Zacian, Shadow Rider, Ice Rider, Miraidon, Koraidon, and Urshifu are all naturally game-breaking. Min-max stats, game-ruining abilities, being immensely more powerful than others of the same type. Some of these Pokemon do have weaknesses. Well, some of them had a weakness until they Tera into Fairy or Water, have a difference of 50 from their attacking stats to their non-attacking stats. The Kyogres have a difference of 80. If we moved 80 points from Xerneas and added it to literally anywhere else in its stat spread, we wouldn't need this many words to come to the conclusion that yes, it would be game ruining. Reminder, Hadron Engine gives a 33% boost to all of Miraidon's attacks, not just its fairy ones like I mentioned previously, and Electric Terrain also gives a 33% boost to its electric attacks that stacks. For good measures, does it make sense now why I think Xerneas is no longer the big bad he once was? I understand how broken Geomancy is. I'm not arguing that Xerneas would be useless. I'm not even arguing that Xerneas won't have a big share of the meta. But I'm not on board with the idea that he is unbeatable, that he is here to ruin Generation 9 like he is often made out to do. But that's not all there is to discuss about Xerneas. Because, like these other Pokemon can Tera away their problems, we have to look if Xerneas can Tera away his own. And then after that, there's still another regulation. I understand that I've only used Tera Fairy for Xerneas for all of my calculations, and there's two reasons for it. One, to see if Geomancy, Tera Fairy, Fairy Aura can delete most Pokemon. Usually it can, however, as we went over, it's not always as easy as Geomancy and win the game. Secondly, most of these matchups are naturally neutral defensively. Ice, Ghost, Electric, Fire, Normal, and Water are all neutral into Fairy. No one type will allow you to defensively Tera out of these matchups. That's why it's still important to look at what the base matchup would look like. Unlike other Pokemon, Xerneas doesn't have a clear weakness it needs to cancel. Xerneas is weak to both Steel and Poison. Steel turns one weakness into a resistance and one weakness into an immunity. So that's the perfect place to start. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons to Steel. First, Tera Steel, Tera Blast plus Sucker Punch or Shadow Sneak can pretty much remove any pesky Fairy Shadow Riders. It's also good into Zacian Stab's Steel. However, they often run Sacred Sword. Plus, Grant Weldon was the only one to actually make top cut with Zacian, and he ran Tera Ground, Tera Blast. Still, it makes a matchup where bringing Xerneas is impossible to at least potentially doable. It also gives coverage into Tera Fairy Miraidon, but it doesn't give resistance to Electro Drift, so the guaranteed OHKO is still very likely. Finally, it gives resistance to Glacial Lance, but most Regulation G Ice Riders run high horsepower. So, once again, we have a bit of a problem. you still struggle into Koraidon, who, reminder, outspeeds and OHKOs, Urshifu Rapid Strikes, who can OHKO with enough support, or 2KOs and then uses a Focus Sash. This is the problem with tearing away from the best type in the game. Looking at threats into Xerneas, I'd probably propose Tera Dragon. It shouldn't alter the Shadow Rider matchup, and you don't need to use that Tera with Ice Rider. Of course, Ice Rider Urshifu is still dangerous, but if you prep specifically with something like Ogerpon and a Fake Out line, then it's definitely doable. It resists Electric Miraidon, and you can force a game of predictions for Draco Meteor D-Gleam. It's not perfect, but guaranteed OHKO is a lot worse. A similar line is made against Koraidon. Flare Blitz no longer threatens to OHKO, and with some recoil, neutral Tera Blast will actually get the KO. Or you can get the sweet Geomancy boost and outspeed. I'm not going to ignore the possibility of a Scale Shot or a Close Combat into the Tera prediction, but both moves won't normally OHKO Xerneas, so it's a risk that is potentially in your favor. Dragon Tera still won't let you take a neutral Behemoth Blade. Dragon's also not great against the Fairy type moves that a Zacian will get, not that it matters. Dragon is also good into Zamazenta, but Chen Pao. Pokemon like Raging Bolt and Fluttermane will get a super effective Dragon or Fairy move where it would have only had the ability to attack it neutrally. Dragon has some good benefits, and there's some really good potential value, but it's also pretty risky. Just as one Nasty Plot can be enough to win a game, one Geomancy can decide a game on the spot, so the risk reward is immense. So this does build me a little bit more confidence for Xerneas, but do I think that I found one that lets him eclipse the entire meta? No. The final topic of discussion is the 2025 dual restricted metas. Now, you could probably tell by how much time's left in the video that I won't be talking about this for nearly as long as I ended up talking about each individual Pokemon. Regardless, it's still important and at least a little bit interesting to talk about. Most teams in this 2025 dual restricted meta ended up following a same-ish trend. One high-speed, high-power restricted, and one bulky, slow, often support-based restricted. 45% of teams ended up using Shadow Rider plus Zamazenta. 80% of the total teams in the top cut had a Zamazenta Ice Rider. Now, by the way, most Ice Riders were switched to Leech Seed and Leftovers, a much slower, bulky set. There were also a few Lunala and one Hoa. For Xerneas, its historic partner, Primal Groudon, lost its orb, leaving Groudon a shadow of what Xerneas once knew. In 2019, Xerneas was paired with nearly every viable restricted. I think Xerneas, in this regulation, would have a much bigger impact than in Regulation G, but that is also much harder to predict, as Pokemon that used to like setting up really lost the ability to when switching from Regulation G to Regulation I. Calm Mind Terapagos disappeared, and I don't think Kyogre Calm Mind also had much play afterwards. But Calyrex was also still allowed to click Nasty Plot, so it's variable. I have a little bit of a proposition. How many Pokemon do we think can actually take a D-Gleam Astral Barrage combo? How do you stop Nasty Plot and Geomancy without sacrificing much of your team? Beyond Zacian, stopping one and actually both Geomancy and Nasty Plot would be incredibly difficult, has huge risks, and honestly, I don't know how many Pokemon are even able to attempt that. See, Xerneas, if made public enemy number 1, I think struggles to find the room to set up, at least with the increased modern power that a lot of these Pokemon have. But if you put it on a team with another Pokemon that also is a high priority target, such as Shadow Rider, where if you double up Xerneas, Shadow Rider can win the game with one Nasty Plot, I think you get much better results out of Xerneas. But do I think Xerneas would have been too game-breaking with Geomancy, Fairy Aura, Fairy Terastalization? No. Too many Pokemon can outspeed and take neutral, one-hit knockouts before Xerneas could move. And there are just so many threats, you can't just tear away the problem. Would Xerneas have been very strong? Probably. Would it have ruled Regulation I? That's possible. Is Xerneas more problematic though than a lot of these other modern restricteds? If at all, not by much.